Prime Minister Tony Abbott had his first big test of international diplomatic relations when he met with President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono to try and ease some of the tensions over his tough rhetoric on asylum seekers and his policy to tow back the boats to Indonesian waters and buy up the Indonesian fishing boats. That did make Indonesians bristle. So what's the verdict on the trip? Well, joining me now to talk about that and a number of other political issues is Steve Ciobo, who's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. He's in our Brisbane studio. And Labor's Matt Thistlethwaite, who's in our Sydney studio with me. Welcome to you both.
Hey,
Steve Ciobo,
thanks,
if I could come to you first. I mean, the Indonesian trip, is Tony Abbott walking away from his towing back the boats policy that he's been telling the Australian public about for 3 years?
No, look, absolutely not, Helen, and we stand by all of the policy announcements that we made prior to the election on this issue. Look, I think it's important to put some context around the Prime Minister's visit to Indonesia. Now, we know that Indonesia is one of our most important strategic relationships. The Prime Minister made it clear on a number of occasions prior to the election that we were going to have a Jakarta focus to foreign policy, not a Geneva focus, which stands in stark contrast to the track record of the Labor Party. The Prime Minister said it would be his first overseas visit, and it was. So we're a government that sticks to its word. Now, what we've indicated is that we're going to work strongly in cooperation with Indonesia to achieve the mutual outcome that both countries desire, which is to stop the boats. And you know, Helen, that this was all caused by the Labor Party. When they opened the floodgates, they put the sugar back on the table that has seen 50,000 asylum seekers come and tragically over 1,000 people perish at sea because of the changes Labor made. Now, we're going to repair that damage. We're going to get the relationship stronger, and I'm very confident that it'll be in the long-term interests of both Australia and Indonesia.
Steve, just sticking with you for the moment before I bring Matt in. Now, just sticking with the Prime Minister too, he has softened his rhetoric. I mean, he talked very much in that joint press statement that the two leaders made in Jakarta the other night. He was incredibly deferential to the Indonesian president, and he really did soften his rhetoric. He talked about, you know, we will very much respect Indonesian sovereignty. That very much sounded like he was softening his stance.
Well, look, Helen, you might say that, but I can only sit here and say to you that the government stands by all the policies that we've announced previously. We will continue to turn back boats where it's safe to do so. We will continue to only offer temporary protection visas. We will take the sugar back off the table that Labor put there. And you know what, Helen? In the fullness of time, the Australian people will judge what we've done by looking at whether we have been able to, over time, reduce the flow of asylum seekers to Australia, and we hope, of course, to stop entirely boat arrivals into Australia. Now, that's probably unlikely to happen that we'll stop it entirely.
All
Even
right, but
the Howard government wasn't able to achieve that. Is he going to stick with
towing the boats back to Indonesian waters and buying Indonesian fishing boats?
Well, hang on, we've never said that we would tow boats back. This has become some kind of media-driven or Labor-driven furphy. What we said was that we would turn boats back where it was safe to do that. And you know what, Helen? We've done it before. Even Kevin Rudd said that they would turn boats back, but then, of course, he walked away from it. So there's nothing controversial about it.
Isn't turning boats back essentially the same as towing boats back? It's turning them around on the end of a rope or something like that and taking them back in the direction from which they came.
Helen, look, I'm loath to get caught up into a question of semantics that, you know, where this is now going. The reality is this. We said we'll turn boats back. Now, it's a long way away for you and I sitting in TV studios to be talking about what the brave men and women of the Australian Navy do out there on the open waters. But the reality is that this is not a controversial thing. We've done it before. The Australian Navy has done it in a whole range of different theatres around the globe, including, for example, in the Persian Gulf, and including, importantly, in the northern seas above Australia with respect to asylum seekers historically. But the key point is this. We want to focus on a close working relationship with Indonesia. We know that we were able to achieve that, and we believe that with the fullness of time, the Australian people will see we're true to our word.
All right, Matt Thistlethwaite, you have been accused by Steve Ciobo and by the coalition government really of putting the sugar on the table. It was Labor who attracted the boats in the first place, the surge, I suppose you could say, after 2008, 2009.
Well, we tried to take the politics out of this issue on many occasions. It's one of the most difficult public policy areas that any government's had to deal with. And what we did was we asked an expert panel headed by Angus Houston,
No, but
to
just
come up.
back earlier than that, did you allow more boats to come in?
No, I don't believe we did. I think the push factors have significantly
You
changed.
live on another planet, Matt, if you believe
and we're
that.
recognising
That's
that.
a crazy
And
statement.
that's being recognised now, because despite the fact that the Liberal Party's been elected to government, the boats haven't stopped. They're still coming. And Tony Abbott's trip to Indonesia has been a massive back down from the policy that they took to the election. I think it needs to be put in context, Helen. Last week, the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, had a private meeting with the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Marty Natalegawa. She immediately went out after that meeting and held a press conference and said that she discussed turning back boats, the tough line that the coalition would take on this issue, and they would stop the boats. The Indonesian government went to the unprecedented step of having to release the minutes of that meeting to prove that Julie Bishop was misleading the public, that what she said had occurred in that meeting was not true. And I've got no doubt...
What's your proof of a back down? What's your evidence for saying
I've got no
that?
doubt that in the wake of that embarrassment for Australia, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade officials have advised the Prime Minister, you cannot go to Indonesia with this rhetoric anymore. You will embarrass Indonesia, you will risk their sovereignty, and you will embarrass Australia. And on the basis of that advice, thankfully, Tony Abbott took the advice and he didn't go to Indonesia and make those ridiculous claims that had been made in the election campaign, and they've backed down.
So are you saying he actually sort of went on bended knees to try and repair some of the damage that had been done with those increasing tensions?
He definitely went on, to repair some of the damage, and he's taken the advice, in my view, of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which has been good, sensible advice, and emphasised a cooperative approach with Indonesia, the approach that Labor's been taking in government, when we were in government, to dealing with this issue. You're not going to get a lasting solution unless you've got the cooperation of the Indonesian government, and thankfully he saw sense on this issue.
Steve Ciobo, just finally on this issue, did Tony Abbott have to sort of go cap in hand to the Indonesians and really tone down his rhetoric?
Frankly, gobsmacked. I mean, I'm sitting here and I just find the things that Mark is saying incredible. I mean, this guy just turned around and said to you that he doesn't believe that Labor put the sugar back on the table. And he said it with a straight face. I mean, this is coming from the Labor Party. When we left office in 2007,
Steve, if you could just stick to what I've asked you, because you have made that point before, if you could answer the question, do you think Tony Abbott did have to go cap in hand and soften his rhetoric?
Not for one second. And this was the second point I was going to make, Helen. I mean, Matt has turned around and made this comment about all this foreign affairs advice, and that's why Tony's gone cap in hand. That's complete rubbish. He's making that up. He doesn't know that. I mean, you tell us, Matt, how do you know what advice the Prime Minister's received from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade? You don't know that they've said anything even remotely close to what you're claiming they've said. And now you turn around and say it as if it's a statement of fact. I mean, this is just unbelievable for a Labor person to be sitting there making things up with absolutely no knowledge. I mean, please, Matt, tell us.
Well,
how do you know what the advice is? How do you know what the advice from the Foreign Affairs was to the Prime Minister? You don't. You're making it up.
I'm happy to say, Steve, I said, in my view, he's been given advice.
So you're making it up. That's the point.
Department of Foreign Affairs, and I make that assessment on the basis that I used to be the Parliamentary Secretary for the Pacific Islands, and whenever a government official goes overseas, you receive a briefing from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade regarding potentially sensitive issues. And I think, thankfully, in this case, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has given the government strong advice, and they've taken that advice, thankfully.
All right, I do want to move on, gentlemen. I need to move on. I just want to turn to domestic politics. Now, 3 new senators from the Palmer United Party looks like we've got a motoring enthusiast senator, and we've got the Liberal Democrat senator, the Libertarian from New South Wales. Steve Ciobo, these people, even though they would be certainly more conservative, they could be potential problems for Tony Abbott in the new Senate, couldn't they?
Well, the reality is this, Helen, we'll only have issues with new senators if the Labor Party walks away from the clear mandate from the Australian people. I mean, the Australian people in many respects treated the last federal election as if it was a referendum on, for example, the abolition of the carbon tax. Now, if Labor digs their heels in and say, we don't care what the majority of Australians have voted for, we don't care that Australians say that they don't want a carbon tax, if Labor sticks by that and says, we're still going to vote against the coalition's opposition's attempts to repeal the carbon tax, well then yes, we're going to have to negotiate with those minor parties and with the smaller parties, and we're going to have to try to attempt to get our mandate through the Australian Senate.
All right, and could they be problems? For instance, how would Tony Abbott get his paid parental leave scheme through? I mean, Clive Palmer doesn't like it, the Palmer United Party doesn't like it, the Liberal Democrat from New South Wales doesn't like it. So would you try and bring it in this Parliament?
Well, Helen, you're asking
in the
me
next Parliament, but in this Senate, I meant.
Sure, but I mean, you're effectively asking me to crystal ball gaze about who's going to do what. And I mean, of course, I don't have the ability to know what anybody's going to do. All I can do is say to you that if the Labor Party ignores the mandate of the Australian people that's been given to the coalition, well then yes, we are going to have to deal with the minor parties. Now, where they go and how they decide to vote, I guess we'll see in the fullness of time. But I would add this point, which is that we have a strong track record of successfully negotiating with minor parties. We've done it before, and I'm very confident that we'll be able to do it again.
Matt Thistlethwaite, do you think it could be a problem?
Well, this argument about a mandate to remove the carbon tax is the height of hypocrisy from the coalition. In 2007, when Kevin Rudd was elected, he had a mandate to introduce an emissions trading scheme. In fact, at the time, it was the Howard government's policy to introduce an emissions trading scheme. Tony Abbott never once accepted that mandate that the people had given Kevin Rudd in 2007. In fact, he immediately set about destroying two Liberal leaders because they'd sought to negotiate with the Labor Party on the issue. He got Brendan Nelson and then he got Malcolm Turnbull. And then he's refused to accept the fact that over time the majority of Australians have wanted an emissions trading scheme and set about destroying both the Rudd and Gillard governments on this issue until he got his way. So this argument about the mandate is complete hypocrisy from Tony Abbott.
So will you be doing the same thing back to him, saying no, no, no?
Well, we went to the election saying that we would oppose any attempts to remove the price on carbon, and that's the basis on which I was elected in my constituency. It'd be hypocritical for me to now go away and say to the people that elected me, I've changed my view for political expediency, and I won't be.
All right, gentlemen, we will have to leave it there. We have run out of time, but I do want to thank Steve Ciobo in our Brisbane studio and Matt Thistlethwaite here. Thanks so much for joining us.